Hi everyone, so I don't know how this is entirely going to work, so I'm just on my phone as well. But so I thought I'd just do this live stream because I've also filmed a video. So I also filmed a video, but I kind of wanted it partially also as a discussion, just to discuss different things about plecos, their care, and how people commonly perceive them. So the video I filmed was a lot shorter, and I thought I'd do a live stream as well because it can bring up other people's ideas. That probably won't be in the video itself, and I might be able to. So it's just going to be I don't know, maybe a long live stream, maybe a short one, I don't know. But I'm going to give like a 2-hour slot or so. Sorry, really shouldn't be on my phone. So I've written like a load of things down as well. So I understand that I am clashing now with quite a few people potentially. So I did write somewhat of a script that is the old video script. So I see a lot of, because plecos are quite popular fishes, a lot of people want to keep them, they're interested in them. And I think partially this has led to, obviously, there's content on it. And there's so many myths. And I think partially there's also a lot of people that aren't so interested in Loricariidae, in plecos. And then they're doing a video for content. I'll just, so people can see plants more in my bookshelf. So people are interested more in other fishes, and this just leads to kind of gaps in knowledge, and then traditional beliefs of how plecos are kept are spread further, and this kind of causes, I think, quite a few issues, especially if certain people are particularly well trusted. I should have sorted out the background because either it's me there. So I think particularly I've written down a list of things, but also facts about Loricariidae that people should potentially know, because the big one is a lot of people will say that plecos aren't catfish, and this is kind of a bit of an issue, I think, because plecos are clearly catfish, but it depends how you define a pleco. And originally, a lot of people were, hill stream loaches are also known as plecos, but they're loaches. They're totally unrelated to plecos themselves, so Loricariidae. And this, I think, causes so much, it causes issues because they're quite different groups of fish, but I think dietarily the same, so their niche is somewhat similar. So I'll just greet whoever's turned up. So you've got Silver Creek, Tommy, Vibes, Vibes Aquatics, House of Pisces, Mr. G, got Dylan from DGA Aquatics, another pleco person. So hopefully this video is kind of useful. I don't know if it's going to be a little bit more of the basics or maybe not. But for Loricariidae, plecos, they are a family within catfishes. The loaches are entirely different group of, so you got like the catfishes, and then a bit further on is stuff like loaches, and they're more closely related to like carp and things, and hence where you get hill stream loaches, which sometimes get called plecos. But so Loricariidae, they're a group of catfishes. Catfishes don't have scales, and the Loricariidae are defined. So plecos are defined as having dermal plating, which looks like scales, but it's not, and also ventry facing mouth, which can be a little bit confusing because or ventral-facing oval disc, because Callicriidae, which is Corydorus, Hoplosternum, Dianema, don't have a disc. It's more of like a tube sort of thing. And the dermal plating is also shared with them. But others do have that dermal plating. If I can think of any. Platydorus, I guess, which is like humbug catfish or talking catfish, I think. So this is kind of like how there's some morphological identification of it. But the problem is with defining plecos as well. The issue of the word pleco is people don't really use. They kind of pick and mix where they decide what pleco is. So, for example, people will say that a lot of Hybrostomnae are pleco, but then they exclude Ancistrus, which places right in the middle of that subfamily. And then, but then L95 actually places right at the edge of Loricariidae. So otherwise, it's so much of a pick and mix. So that's why I tend to. Just say Loricariidae in general. It just makes it simple. And also Pseudoancistrus. There's a Pseudoancistrus that places right outside at the edge of Loricariidae. So that's Pseudoancistrus Genus. So it's not. It is confusing, and the phylogenies kind of help, but there's also a bit of a mess sometimes because they're only using a few. So yes, Pinaculus. Pinaculus is I think it's a really nice one, but then genetically or taxonomically, they place really strangely. So you've got the Picoltia group, and that includes Pinaculus, but it also includes Scobian and Cistrus, so that's Sunshine Pleco, and I don't think the others actually have a common name. And also, so Pinaculus, Picoltia, Hypancistrus, Ancystomus, and Scobian Ancistrus. And Scobian Ancistrus is really nice and easy to sort of place, but Pinaculus, Picoltia, and Hypancistrus are a bit of a funny one. And we also, I don't think, know that much about them. We have there's quite easy, like Hypancistrus, there's quite clear information on what they actually eat, which is they're not carnivores. I think the only one that might be is Hypancistrus Vandragdae. I don't know the L number for it off the top of my head, but it's the old Microacanthus, so it used to be elsewhere. That's the only one that feeds somewhat carnivorous in a way. And I think that's one of those myths that that Hypancistrus are carnivores. Yeah, L280 for Microacanthus. It's one of those myths, though, that I think people get away with because most diets aren't actually carnivorous diets. So there was a time when a load of people, because I think EBO couldn't be sold in the UK, so people were going to Rapashi bottom scratch and feeding that entirely to their Hypancistrus, and then they get bloat. The problem is bottom scratch is pretty much entirely carnivorous, so if they're not carnivores, they're not going to do well on it. Whereas I would recommend Soylent Green. I've just got a spell because they're quite useful sized tubs to put things in, so I keep having them. It's it's not a middle ground, but you can kind of work on it. Thank you about the tank. The tank's really dull at the moment. I need to get 2 female discus because I've got 2 males and they won't be housed together. So this is my res cover. He's quite old. He's a bit actually lumpy and bumpy. He's got 2 cysts and then I think a tumour. 5 seconds. So he's not looking at his healthiest. Sorry. It's really so, but I always call it phone club when people sit on their phones, and I really shouldn't. But I so badly organise my entire day. Well, so I've planned these videos almost, but I was at the university aquarium this morning. Then I just got home and then I was working. This tank it's okay. It's got some elderly fishes that I'm not quite sure what to do with. And then I've got Neil the eel, who's just there. The knife fish won't come out. And that's mostly cistrus in there, but I do have lassie and cistrus. Oh God, I should know, but I do. So that's a lassie and cistrus. That's not very common, hence why I've only got one. I've got my flash plec as well in there, the male, which pleco prices have gone up quite a bit. They aren't cheap fishes anyway, but getting an adult confirmed female is starting at like £60, and I'm not really like too fussed on breeding them. And I do have some Botanicals AF so the clowns, which escaped into there, and those fishes are smart, so I can't actually get them out. But it kind of, so it's not a bad tank to show what you want for like plecos of all the caves. And I do have wood in there. The Botanicals do benefit off the wood. They use it for behaviour. Everything else doesn't really need it. It's just my issue with rocks is the way the tanks are. I'm a bit worried about rocks falling. So I don't actually have any rocks in there. I'm even worried about the caves. I do need to get more. And yeah, so as DGA Aquatics has put, pleco prices are really, so Brazil and Colombia are an issue at the moment, I believe. Brazil, no one has seemed to be importing them for reliably for like 2 years. Most stores aren't doing like regular ones. They're doing it like once a year, twice a year. And some stores, I think, especially like if they're connected, one store does a big import and then shares it amongst the other stores. And we used to do that with certain fish like Asian arowana, because you import like sort of like 5 and you don't want 5 in a store. So you move them around the different stores. And I think what always annoys me about the prices is the prices aren't consistent with anything about rarity, difficulty, or anything like that. It's just about how much it costs to import and how much, difficulty import, difficulty catching, size of the fish. So, for example, at the time, my big bang sister, she was 160. And at the time, I could get one about half the size, I think, for about 60 to 100 pounds. Now they're about 100, over 100. But yeah, gold nuggets as well, which is I'm so reluctant to try and find. I think I need a reliable female of the gold nuggets, but yeah. And I think also the other thing is catch locality. I don't know whether it's changing a lot. We don't use a lot of countries that used to be used in the past. And variety has somewhat increased, but a lot of people were noting now that it's kind of getting a bit stagnant. There was a time period where you could almost get anything, and now finding something a bit more unusual is a bit more difficult. I think it used to be like gold nuggets were the staple, I think, that all stores had. And now I think the phantoms are somewhat taking over a little bit because they were easier to get. But now there's so many different common bristlenoses and they cover it a lot for people. I think also the pleco trend has just increased in size. There's so many people getting like different plecos, different loricariidae. Since COVID, I guess it's become actually more of a hobby, but it goes through phases. So on the groups, you'll see it be inactive and then suddenly it will peak. And I guess that's where some of these sort of myths and videos from people that don't really have an interest in them, sort of, that's what is good viewership, I guess. But there's all sorts of things, like one of the big myths is size. Is the smallest is 1.8 centimeter standard length from memory. And that's because if you're going to include all Loricariidae, realistically, the smaller ones, so Hyperpotominae, that's like Ottocinclus, Hyperpotoma, Rhinotocinclus and stuff, they're going to count, and they're great fishes. They're just in the smaller size. Some are more social, tend to be a bit more tricky to feed, but they are really tiny, and there's some really tiny Hyperstomnae, like traditional plecos. They do keep finding new species, but doesn't mean they reached a trade at all. It depends where they're caught, and the sort of, there's so many different reasons why they don't reach a trade, or they, and partially is also whether the fishermen think they'd be of interest, because I believe it was L255, so that's the spotted medusa. Most likely the same species as ranunculus, so the L34. That wasn't caught because the fishermen thought there was no point, people wouldn't want it. And you can see it's a stunning fish. For most people, if you like something spotted, they're not easy to keep. There's a very high failure rate, because if you think the amount of people that have bought them over the years, and you see very few adults around. I do know someone that bred them, but I don't know what he did I think he sold them in the end. So they're interesting fishes at the end of the day, but they're just tricky to keep. And it's just one of those so they're just so it's just, and it kind of lends on to a lot of people which think that Loricariidae are just easy, plecos are easy to keep, and some are and some aren't, because there is 1,050 species currently described, and then there's loads more undescribed, which makes it really tricky. Sometimes they don't actually have much information online, like Planet Catfish might not actually have a picture or any information, or any website will. And that means that I think for people that want plecos, once you get past some of the more, I guess, really common ones, even then, you're having to go down a sort of a little bit more of a difficult route with science and scientific names, L numbers, etc. I'm just going to... which is why I kind of don't recommend them always. Well, I don't recommend them at all when people say, I want centerpiece fish, because firstly, you're probably not going to... Quite a few aren't the most obvious fishes. They're one of those fish that you kind of have to get used to not being able to see them even. But so size, definitely, a lot of people just say they get large anyway, and that's kind of annoying, but then it's more stemming from common plecos, and I will always back up common plecos because I think they're brilliant for the size they are. They're generalists, they're easier to feed, and if you've got a bigger tank, you're going to have fish, and you're mostly going to have other sort of generalist fish. They adapt in temperature and diet. They're not actually that big, and a lot of people go for like a Acanthicus, which is like bordering a meter standard length, potentially 60 centimeters at least, and there's no slating of them, and they're really attractive to people when they're little, so people buy them. And then also Panac is just a monster, so the royal plecos. Shafari, which gets missold as the smallest Panac, that's like 60 centimeters, just standard length. And then obviously like Pseudocanthicus, they're nasty, they're big, high temperatures. The larger ones, there's quite a few. It's just that Pteroplectes, the common plecos, aren't that bad, and they're very adaptable. Even like with the Hypostomus, so Hypostomus luteus, which used to be over £1,000, but now I think they're going down to about 800. And that one's very adaptive with temperature. Obviously, it's quite a price tag. There's loads of large hypostomus. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about habitat. But okay, so L174. I don't know anyone that would have them, but it's always worth waiting. There's a lot of seasonal lists as well. Like when I look at wild discus, they're always just that January time. And I think a lot of things will have it on the list or not even put it on till it's seasonal. And Lucius is lovely. I worked with one. She was a good size. I've got photos of her next to my hand and stuff, and I've got one where I've held her. They're monsters. Very adaptable, but they're meant to be nasty. She was only on her own with, I think we had some juvenile jaguars, because like baby jaguars in the sump with her. But she was known to take on like gibiceps, so gibiceps. Yeah, prices. It's really awful with like the small fish when their prices are so high. So DJ Aquatics has said that all the ones on the lists and the ones he's seen are 60 to 80. And it's really difficult because if you want a group, you want at least hope of getting both. And with juveniles, I don't know, but it's a little bit more of a risk, and then rehoming or finding ones to get that balance. And 60 to 80 for something very small is, especially recent, I think, actually not recently, since COVID, a lot of the fish are much smaller than they used to be. A lot of the corridors you used to be able to get in at a good size that you could not, maybe within a year, few months breed, and now they're just a lot smaller. And same, I've never seen so small individuals in source. Maboo puffers are the big one. Like Maboos used to always come in like maybe 10 centimeters, and now there's ones that are like pea puffer sized. And someone's gonna have to upgrade whatever tank they put that in, because a small puffer, at least if it's like that big, you can kind of work around it. But when they're like that big, maybe not. Yeah, I think so. Mr. G has put about searching L numbers. I always have to look them up. Well, some L numbers I know off the top of my head, but I'm always looking them up just in case. And also, numbers are much easier to forget, I find, than scientific names. So I find it much easier to use the scientific name. And then there's also some common names are like where it's undescribed and it has a locality name or something like that, like Ancestors Cheese Creek. I don't know if it has an L number, but I know it's from Cheese Creek in Peru, and or other sort of, there will be other common names. But I'm not always the biggest fan of the L number system. I find it a little bit unhelpful in places, and also where the L numbers overlap, they're wrong, or there's like one species has multiple. So gold nuggets, it's really not helpful, because like there's even the green gold nugget, the verde, and that doesn't have an L number. So it's like, what do you do with it? Yeah, so DJ has put, it's hard because if you want that species and you need a good sized group, and also if they grow slowly. And sometimes I think also some fishes are so prone to stunting, you don't really want juveniles because it's just so much more work and actually knowing what to feed them. So with other fishes like cichlids, it's quite common to buy a group and then just rehome the ones that aren't in the pair. With Loricariidae, it's a little bit more difficult, and you're never going to make your money back that easily, especially if you're rehoming individuals, they're not going to sell secondhand as much as you bought them normally. Just because stores have staff to pay, stuff like that. And also on secondhand websites, usually everyone's in there for a deal. So, and it's so stressful, which is why I don't sell anything secondhand if I can. I either usually bin it or give it away. I don't know. Yeah, and all the ones are captive, and they probably are related. I agree. Hypensistrus zebra, I've wondered, because I know a lot of stores use the same suppliers, and you wonder about their original stock. And I think that is a big thing with snow whites, bristlenoses, because they kind of just appeared. Even though they've been in the hobby a long time, they just kind of appeared in the trade when they started picking up in price. Other things, but I had something in mind, but I've totally forgotten about. It's kind of easy just to go wild caught in a way. But yeah, so it's kind of, yeah. Anyway, so I'll mention habitat a little bit, because a lot of people, I think one of the big misconceptions when it comes to South American fishes is that they're all black water. And for some reason, there's this idea that South America is just black water. And there's loads of different companies, hobbyists, channels, all built on that black water idea. And some are really good with knowing about that very specific type of habitat, but a lot of freshwater isn't. A lot of South America isn't black water, and also not agapo either. Agapo has to be, is where you get that, would it be the bloodshed, but it's where there's going to be the sort of the leaf litter, the fruits from the forest itself, which isn't all that really related to Loricariidae entirely, just because if you look at a lot of their habitats, maybe whiptails, so like Farlawella, twig catfish, Styrosoma tichthys, stuff like that, potentially, but there's not really any leaf litter in most of the hyperstomanae habitats if you look at it. Obviously there's so many exceptions. But it's one of those big bugbearers for me, because the main thing with leaf litter is actually being able to siphon. Because if you've got your siphon and you're trying to get some detritus or waste from the bottom, which is just pure waste, the leaf litter will just stick to the siphon, and it used to drive me mad. And whether it actually provides the bacteria the fish will feed on, I'm not entirely convinced. So I've got even some more fresh wood actually to add to the tanks, but it does grow a lot of biofilms, and those biofilms don't particularly seem to actually feed the fishes particularly well. Fibrous aquatic says ours favourite way to get aquarium to black water and keep it that way. You're going to have to go with botanicals generally. It depends on the botanical and how hard your water is to which is going to be best. So something like, so I used palms were quite good when I last used them, and now my water's not like ultra soft, and the palms did a very good job. So Trachycarpus fortunae, like the common, I think it's not umbrella palm, is it? But the common palm that a lot of people use. So that palm or Indian almond leaves are usually really good, but keep it that way. You just have to keep on turning it over and adding more. Peat is another way, but peat is obviously environmentally not the most environmentally sustainable thing to use. It's also worth thinking whether your fish actually are black water or not. The other aspect when it comes to tannins, which I need to write an article on, but I also need to do a lot more research into it, is that tannins are anti-nutrients. They are technically also toxins. So it depends whether the fishes are actually adapted to tannins at all, or the black water habitat. So it's worth just, because otherwise it does save a lot of hassle. But botanicals is probably the way to go. If they're black water, they've probably got tannins in there. Botanicals, apart from like the main channel of like the Rio Negro and stuff like that. Bogwoods as well. So it's very hit and miss on bogwood. I haven't bought bogwood in years, but some of these really do leach a lot, and some really don't. But generally, if they're like the traditional bogwood will. And the reason I kind of talk about this a little bit is a lot of loricariidae are riverine fishes. There are some that inhabit more lakes, so the Xingu common pleco, Pteroplectes. I don't think it's Xinguensis, but that's more of a lotic, so a lake habitat it seems to be from. But that means they do need a lot of flow. They benefit from a lot of flow. Some more than others, like the twigs and stuff like that, you can easily get away with it. But a good amount of flow is definitely really useful. I don't know about yucca at all. I personally, if I'm not sure, I wouldn't add it. But there's also a lot of things when it comes to plants. If they're eaten is the main issue, because that can lead to, some do have other toxins involved. So stuff like, alloys in general. So like, this is really not happy philodendron plougmani, but they have a lot. These ones I can't read, but toxic plants. If they're eaten, not so much in the water. But it's kind of like it's a precaution sort of thing. But ochre also has tannins that are toxic if eaten, but I think it focuses in the acorns themselves. So yeah, flow is definitely one of the most important things, I think, for plecos, and they really benefit from that oxygen, particularly the high temperature. So a lot of mine need 28 degrees or above, and without that, they tend to not do so well anyway. But I think the biggest thing is when you see a lot of videos on plecos or articles and stuff, and they're not someone that really does much with plecos, is that generalization of the entire 1,050 species, because temperature depends on the species and parameters. A lot of people don't realize how varied South America is, and loricariidae are found, so plecos are found from the sort of very high elevation all the way down to very low elevation. Some deal with massive changes in parameters over the year, and some don't deal with much at all. So like Ketostoma, the rubber nose, sometimes called bulldog pleco, but that gets confused with others. And that they deal with, I think it's anywhere from, is it 22 degrees all the way to 28, and then a pH of 6 all the way to pH 8. And they're amazing fishes, Ketostoma, but they're not always the most understood, and very few people breed them anyway. Yes, I forgot, as Mr. G says, alder cones are brilliant for anything, for black water, or just creating that tannins in general. Just make sure it's not anywhere that's treated. rinse it beforehand. You don't want anything that's potentially been fouled on by the dogs or any other wildlife. So that is a particularly, I've got a few alder trees by me and I've been tempted, but they are through a massive like walkway, like along by the river sort of thing. So I don't know. Also, siphoning of them I've heard is worse. And I don't actually need to siphon my tanks that much. Usually the externals pick up a lot. But this tank at the moment, it might just be that there's certain bacteria that stick everything together. Is not the easiest thing to do. Siphon that tank at the moment. I don't know entirely why. L15, so that is bitter toe, isn't it? LO on 5. Yes, they're really nice. Or if you can find Pleco lineola, which is similar, but it's more spotted in a way, and sometimes they have really nice blue eyes. I did work with a really nice adult group. Not the easiest to breed though, Pleco in general, I believe. I don't know many people that do. It might just be that not many people actually have adults, but they do live an awful long time. So one of the people in the CSG, I think, has over 20-year-old ones, but might be much older because they're originally from someone else, I think. Roots, wood, some of it just takes forever to sink. I had one bit I just gave up on. Nowadays, with my setups, because that one was a fancy goldfish setup, and fancy goldfish they're clumsy as hell. Nowadays, I just leave it to float. But if it's going to take months, I wouldn't. With any of the branches, I'm just going to leave it. Checking which that L number is, sorry. I don't like using L numbers. Oh, L103 is... Do people use that for... Oh. I'm not... Sorry, I've just... Because the first thing that comes up with L103 is Botanicals ephemacus. And the thing is with clown plecos, I just find it... So people call them L104, is it? So that's true Botanicals macus. We don't have that in the trade. Then there's Botanicals, the L448, which also is no longer in the trade anymore. And I've noticed that there's multiple undescribed species that seem to be being sold as Botanicals macus, because there's one that I think is more similar to L105. And I don't see them much anymore. So the one I used to have, a 12-year-old one and a 20-year-old one, till she sorted them out. But these ones I've got in here are much smaller, and the ones I've got at the university are much smaller. They mature at a much smaller size anyway. But these Pleco are interesting. They kind of look like Botanicals in a way. But I find Botanicals and Pleco, if they're not DNA sequenced, or sometimes I think they're not analysed in morphologically in the right way, they end up placing in the wrong genus anyway. Because if my paper eventually gets finished, then I do have a phylogeny, and I use quite a few genes, and there's 2 Pleco that are not Pleco. Yeah. Yeah, good, long green fan, green dragons they're lovely. I was tempted originally to get some before they seem to reach the UK market. But then I think they used to be like really expensive here at one point. I think like 70. And then all the stores, they were just really small fishes anyway, the ones that came in. I was tempted also, if I have a fish room, I'd like to selectively breed different variants, but I can't obviously at the moment. Probably not for 5 or more years. Academic life is not easy if you want fish tanks, really, or pets in general. Yeah, so Mohammed's mentioned that he had an 8-year-old one. It happens. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you never know why they die. It could be all sorts of things. Anything from diet. And diet doesn't. It's not something that you'll suddenly see the decline, or you might see a slow decline, but you might not even notice. I was listening to a podcast and they mentioned fatty liver disease, which I have seen in the literature, and I can't remember why I couldn't find much on it, but it's one of those things that if you look up fatty liver and fish or anything with those search terms, you just get human disease, because fish are meant to help with liver disease in humans. So it's really difficult to know, and diaminase is another one. But also just in general, they might not, there's going to be individuals that aren't going to live as long as others, and it's so difficult to know. But the size of the fish doesn't really correlate entirely with how long they live. A lot of catfishes just don't die. The best ones, I think, if you want a fish for life, that's not difficult to keep. Synodontis are great. Loads of people have 20-plus-year-old synodontis, 30-year-old plus. Loricariidae are just a little bit more challenging. They're just a little bit more challenging. So there's 30-year-old plus common plecos, but it's actually being able to get those fish to live, and also how long they've been in the trade or that able to access. Like there are a few like wild hypensistrous zebra left, who were before the ban, which was 2010, 2008 or something like that. So, and I had that 20-year-old and the 12-year-old Botanicals from Macas. Just don't keep bigger species with tiny ones, especially if they've got a temper like she has. I can see my Platystachys out. I don't know the symptoms, so this is something I really need the time to research. So fatty liver, or it's just, I think it might be easy to just say liver diseases, because I don't know. I never saw it in any of my dissections. The main thing I see of Loricariidae is, it seems to be, maybe it's intestinal issues. It just seems they, so in the discus book I found it, and there's not much research, but what's it? Intestinal malocclusion, I think it is, where the intestines just break open and then it causes a sudden death. So the Discus Health book by, please don't knock everything over when I grab it. So this is the book. So it's one of those really good health books I got given. It's very old, and some of the pages actually stick together. But this actually is quite useful for identifying like old diseases that don't get talked about anymore. I don't know the background of the guy entirely. I tried to look it up, but I know it's well respected, and he's got another fish disease book. But that's intestinal blockages and stuff breaking open the intestines, I guess is the easiest way of putting it. I only know because when I had my wild discus, I had, I assume what is now poisoning. They just were healthy, swimming around feeding. Then you could watch it within half an hour. They would go black and just die. So I assume that was poisoning, because don't have expensive fishes in a room that other people can access, I guess is the answer. But it's one of these books I do recommend. I've got quite a few books, and I tend to only buy ones I know have really useful information these days, because otherwise. So green beans, I have used them. None of my fish will touch them, and I do have ancestors. I am not. Is that? Oh no, I don't want to be on. So I'm on Andrew's live, so Aquarium Dailies somehow. But so sorry, back to green beans. So my fish won't eat. A lot of people like canned beans. I don't know whether there's a difference for canned beans. It might be there's some additive that the fishes prefer. It depends on the fish. I wouldn't feed it for most fishes as sort of a main part of their diet, because especially if you're feeding plecos, which I actually did write down this about most vegetables. Most of them don't actually feed on a lot of plants. They feed on algae, so something more higher in protein. I would say more vitamins and minerals. Easier to digest because that's what they're evolved for. Plants are quite difficult to digest if you're not evolved for actually eating plants. I think mosses, they do seem to feed on a little more. They're easier to digest, and I have been tempted to actually manage to try and add mosses to their diet, because almost, I guess, blending, when you buy for reptiles, you could buy like dehydrated moss. But I don't know if nutritionally it's any good. And they might just be feeding on it as they're grazing. There's some moss there and they just eat it. And the papers actually only say bryophytes, which can mean liverworts as well. Garlic, this is one I definitely need to research. I'm not entirely sure. I know that long term, it's not best as like a constant feed. It's more of one to feed occasionally. I don't entirely trust it being that great for dealing with parasites. It's more if you want, because it's not going to be that sudden thing to purge them, but it's also not going to, long term, it's not that healthy for them. But I wouldn't, like a clove every so often, I wouldn't have an issue with if they eat it. It'd be great if your fish doesn't normally eat and it does get them eating, then I have no issue, and then just working from there. Because sometimes you go feed that stuff that isn't that great for them just to get them eating. Something like a lot of those diets that are cereal based or fish meal based. Unless your fish actually eat fish in the wild, which very few of the fish we keep do. But yeah, so people think green and think it's great, and that goes for the whole of fish keeping, or in general. People see plants and think that's natural. All aquariums need plants. And then, like, I was listening to a podcast, and these reptile people, not all of them keep fish, I guess, or are that interested in the fish. So that's where you see some of the myths that kind of spread. That, like, the long-term myths that unless you're enthusiastic in fishes, you're not going to see. And there'd be like, you have to have plants, and then you don't have to water change, you only have to top up. And it's like, but you've only got test kits for a few things, not everything. So green in general, it's vitamin G anyway, the vitamin green, because plants are beneficial for our mental health. But that's because we also come from a habitat that has them, and not all fishes do, and a lot of fishes don't really have the plants or what we think of as plants. Peanuts, so seeds is one thing I want more people to try out. I don't have the fish that would eat seeds in the wild, but anyone with Hypancistrus, even Picoltia, I do have Botanicals. They probably wouldn't. But anything, try seeds with different fishes and see if they eat them, because Hypancistrus definitely eat them in the wild. Picoltia might do. What else? Maybe even Scorpion and Cistrus might be worth trying. Oh, and maybe just some of those substrate-dwelling Loricariidae. Seeds are great. I think they're high in protein, generally high in nutrition. Peanuts I don't know about. Obviously don't if someone's got an allergy in the house. But it probably is worth trying. Yeah, so cucumber catching pest snails. One thing is, pest snails actually, a surprising number of different fish actually eat snails, but at low numbers as well. Which maybe in a few months I can discuss more about it. I could definitely say ancestors do not feed on snails, and it goes in and out one way, as if it was never processed at all. So also for pest snails, yeah, assassin snails are just a nightmare. And I don't know what brings them out there, but they always come out when I'm not able to actually pick them out the tank themselves. Because otherwise they're a nightmare. So also regarding like Pleco, I think I've kind of covered it with like caves, wood, rocks. You could be quite creative with it. And one thing I would say is I actually do advocate sand in a way. They're not like Corydoridinae or loaches or goldfish. Most of them aren't, so they're not going to really interact in the same way. But there are substrate-dwelling Loricariidae. Stuff like Planilocoria, so whiptails, Pseudohemiodon, Loricaria. Funny enough, Loricaria is, I guess, like, there's not many, like, true plecos that actually are called, like, Hypostominae that are called, like, Loricaria in the name. But the funny thing is, also in this group is Loricariidae. So when people think about Pleco, which I think I should have got into earlier, and trying to name plecos, Loricariidae is a whiptail catfish, like Farlawella and stuff, but it's actually what Plecostomus was synonymized into Loricariidae. So Plecostomus is a whiptail catfish. There is Hypostomus plecostomus. And then the other thing that bugs me about it, it's a bit of a tangent anyway, is Neoplecostomus. That's more of an Otocinclus. And there's quite a few of them. Like there's the whole sort of tribe known as Neoplecostominae, which is an Otocinclus, and well, very large Otocinclus, I'd say, like that big. The specimen I handled was Parihapsis. So about that big. You won't see them in the aquarium trader. I really want them. But yeah. So the name of Plecostomus is just really silly. Yeah, so that's, as I mentioned at the beginning, yes, Pleco should refer to all Loricariidae. It just makes it so much more simple rather than sort of picking and choosing, because when you say Plecos, it kind of makes people aren't sure what. No one's going to have the same idea. Like some people exclude Ancistrus for some reason, but then it's like, what about the Medusa Pleco? So then it's like some Ancistrus, apart from Ancistrus ranunculus, and then also not Ancistrus macropithalamus. Common names are just a mess, really. And it's not the only one. I guess sometimes catfish can be a little bit confusing because I think in Germany and Austria, maybe catfish actually tends to refer to the whiskered like Ictuluridae, North American catfish, or the what would it be, like Silurus, stuff like that, which they call whales. But then you get L whales, which is L number catfish. Yeah, common names are great for the big group. So catfish, siluriforms, gymnotiform, true knife fish, because otherwise, actually, yes, that's a great example of very confusing common name, because knife fish is like, you got gymnotiforms in South America, closely related to tetra, catfish, carp. Then you got then you've got the Asian and African ones, which are not even like one group, because it also includes like Memoridids, which are elephant noses, dolphin fish, I think the short ones are known as. And yes, so as Featherfin Films has said, ones that aren't entirely taxonomic. Yeah, I think sometimes it does cause confusion, like if people are trying to put broad statements out, like eels will jump from your tank. Well, even these sort of do, but he's never jumped. He just terrorizes everything. But there's a lot that isn't entirely taxonomic, and especially it's very confusing when you get Facebook groups, I think, or websites designated. I know one of the Corridorus groups was contemplating changing their name after that revision, but which the revision is pretty much unknown anyway. The lineage system has been around. I think there's a 2011 sort of introduction to it, and the paper, I think the original paper is 2011, the one that really set off more of the science towards it. Organising things. My room is an absolute tip, like, because I'm doing some experiments at the moment with feeding fish experiments. I've got plaster of Paris on the floor, and there is a whole tub that I won't be using. So I'm like, what do I do with a whole tub of plaster of Paris? Which the only solution is, if I break a limb, I can just I've got plenty of plaster. But yeah, so I'm not a big fan of calling them corries. And if people call them Corridora, it does bug me. Like, there's no singular or plural to genera, even though genera are plural. But it's just Corridorus. I don't really like shortening names. I'm not a big fan of saying Pleco, but if I did all my videos and just said how to keep this Loricariidae, and people would be like, what are you talking about? Because like, sometimes the names just need to be used. But there's so many confusing names. Yeah. I'm actually wondering where Corridorus started. I get really curious about where certain trends start. Like Epistylis, we all know where that started. Has no citations because it won't get any. But just sort of caught on. It's not like... But as I said before in some other thing, I think, if you like Corridora, there's now Hoplosoma that ends in an A. But then I think Hoplosoma has so what was Corridorus trilineatus, commonly sold as the Julie Corrie. Now it's Hoplosoma trilineatum, which is going to traumatize quite a few people even more. On that sort of other myths, I'm not trying to get through a list, but on other myths, I always like to discuss fish food because it's one of the most interesting topics to me, or just feeding fishes in general. Nutrition is, I just think, quite interesting. But one of the biggest myths about plecos, loricariidae, is what they eat. A lot of people make very broad statements. So most plecos are omnivores. Firstly, what do people mean by omnivory or omnivores? That's quite a broad sort of statement. And if they were all omnivores or all one diet or mostly one diet, sorry, why is that? Oh, sorry, it's annoying me that it's wonky. No. So if they're all one diet, why is there 1,050 species? Why is there so much diversity in their mouth shapes, their jaws, all of that? They're not all the same thing. And even with even with that variation, there's a lot of specialism. And we don't really know the full extent of it. The only real in-depth studies are into those that get assumed to eat wood, because xylivores are always going to be an interest to people, I guess, but they don't digest wood, and we know that. I'm just going to open the bottle. I think they're quite a good example in that they partition their niche from others. But first, I'll say loricariidae are actually mostly detritivores or algivores. And we have plenty of sort of examples or proof of this. What is meant by detritivory is like biofilms, bacteria. So biofilms, algae, sort of fungi. It's a mixture of different organisms. And that's what most of them eat, but it doesn't mean that they're all eating the same thing. And you'll notice that if you've got plex and you're like, they're not cleaning my tank, it's covered in algae, it's probably the wrong sort of algae that they're going to be naturally feeding on. They won't recognize it as food. Another one is, a lot of people know this food's very high in spirulina or chlorella. Is it pronounced chlorella? And they just won't touch it. And then people say they don't eat cyanobacteria, which spirulina is a type of cyanobacteria. But they do. There's plenty of example of them feeding on in the wild. It's just the wrong type. Like this is high in spirulina, but it's probably got the other things that will make them eat. And one of the, regardless of how healthy the diet is, the fish actually needs to feed on it. Which is kind of important because algae are not the most helpful. There's not that many algae around in diets, and they're not really going to clean your tank. Like mine do not clean my tanks, and I have had when I was using the palm leaves, I had massive like bacterial growths, and they did not touch that. But there's plenty of examples of them just not touching biofilms on glass and stuff. And so Mr. G has said, if you had several different bristlenose types, would they eventually breed? And if they did, would it be like shrimp? So if it's the common bristlenose, I'll leave that up for a bit. But if it's the common bristlenose, yes, they will breed easily just together. And it's not really like shrimp entirely. We don't really, the genetics isn't entirely well understood. Like if you put a snow white with a green dragon, what do you get? Or if you put one with the other, what do you get? And a lot of people they're doing the initial cross, not liking the F1, so the first generation, so probably not going further. But if you go further, you're going to start seeing the more interesting genetics. But different, they would revert to wild type eventually if you don't control it, which the wild type is that sort of brown, but there's so much variety in the brown coloration, and it would depend on those initial genetics, no doubt, because The browns, the albinos definitely get a lot larger, but it might be a lot of people haven't had their bristle noses that long enough for them to get to a good size, because bristle noses do get big. I was going to have an example, but I don't really have an example of a common bristle nose. I was just going to show sort of size. But the other thing is, when it comes to bristlenose as ancistrus as a whole, there is around 50 currently described species. It's a massive group of plecos. They actually differ massively. Like, there's difference in chromosome number. There's difference in sex chromosomes. So some use a method more similar to mammals. Others are more similar to birds. Some use multiple different methods. So it depends on the species. Like Ancistrus ranunculus is definitely not going to be spawning with the common bristlenose. And there's also not really a complete understanding of how they're all related together. And the behaviour differs so much. Like Ancistrus ranunculus, macrophthalmus, they're all quite social, whereas the common bristlenose will not tolerate more than one in their own cave, other than spawning. Yes, so House Pisces mentioned Chosium love eating pleco poop, which I can understand quite a bit, especially if you're using certain foods, probably won't get digested. So they'll be using that. There's probably a lot of bacteria. It's actually digesting or feeding on waste is not always a bad idea. And that leads on to something I think that is quite useful to just consider, is if you've already got plecos, especially related species, not clearing out the waste when you put new ones in, say, if it's a quarantine or whatever, because there could be beneficial bacteria that they'd have lost from that import, that shipping situation. So it's always worth thinking about. It's not something that many people consider. Yeah. New strains of fish is really interesting, though. Mr. G's just said that he's not planning on starting a new strain, but it's just something interesting on trying. If you've got space, guppies are probably the easiest, but I think someone mentioned, is it 5 per variety, 5 tanks? I just say thank you both for the super sticker. It's really kind of you. Thank you. So yeah, so I think spirulina and let me find where you put the pronunciation. Corellia, is that right? I think it's the easiest to access. So I do have bags of like algae and stuff like that. I've got. Oh no, they're going to think that's food. No, you can't eat algae. Most I don't use, but like I've got that and stuff. There's not many algae that you can get, and they're quite expensive, which is how bad. I was going to make fish food for people, and I just never did. So a lot of this is actually, I can't now use it because it's out of date. There's not much you can actually get, and whether they eat or not, because I've noticed they don't eat this, and I buy by the kilogram because it's kind of cheaper. Got so much. Fish food. This isn't even ones they're going to eat because I then blend it down. But like that, it absolutely does really grow. What ones? So this one's wakame. That's more. I guess would you use it in sushi and noodles and stuff. This one, bladder wrap. I assume it's fine. It's mostly airtight and it's dry anyway. But yeah, they don't. I might make a way of them being able to eat it. Yeah, seeds. I had more ingredients, but those definitely did go off. My room is a tick. I also had nori, so the big sheets. I don't know that. This is why I do that. I mix actually algae in with Repashy now, just because they definitely eat it, and I don't have the time or trial tanks to get something they definitely feed on. But this I'm mixing because the gelling agent's really good. I might also use like Pleco pops and stuff like that, but they definitely feed on it. Especially if you have fussy ones. Mine don't even touch like most courgettes. They like certain cultivars, just not all, and these ones even more fussy. I don't know what drama the Botanicals has decided he wants a different cave. But yeah, so I think it's just, it might also be, as you kind of I guess inferred, that we also associate those ones with health. Whereas, like, the bladder rack, that does not sound nice. But I just got loads from, like, health food stores and mixing them together. But diet is one of the most misunderstood things, and also being able to partition it. Because if they're algivores, doesn't mean they're feeding on the same algae. So, as I said, some do feed on a lot of cyanobacteria, but different cyanobacteria. So there's only so much we can do. The other thing is there are small additions that you can add to the other diets. Like for Panaculus, they feed on fungi, same for Panac. So mushrooms, there's not really, I don't know of any other, I guess yeast you could feed, any other source of like fungi. So I had also up here with wood because they don't, none of them digest wood or use it in digestion. But, and that's one of the most annoying myths for me, is because I can always provide the papers if people want them. But so we know from isotopes, we know from gut analysis, we know from feeding studies that none of them digest wood. The digestion thing doesn't really entirely make sense because it's only those groups that do. But we do know from the papers that those certain genera that do, and so it's a genera that do feed on fungi, bacteria that grows in the wood, but they don't have to have it from the wood because there's Panac found in the absence of wood. But it does, I think a lot of people kind of, there's that wishful thinking that they do have that really unusual niche. But even more interesting is that I think instead of that, they're actually partitioning what they're feeding. So while everyone else is feeding on the surface of the wood, everyone else is feeding on rocks, they can actually get to food which none of the others can. I guess it's somewhat similar to anteaters and ii and stuff, where they're getting at invertebrates inside of the wood. They're not feeding on the wood themselves. So, but then that does also lead to those diets which contain wood. So I'm not going to name any brands also, but they're very high in cellulose, which they can't digest and isn't used in digestion. You don't get the behavioural benefit if you're going to have wood as a hiding place or as something for them to gnaw on if they're one of those genera. So, and I don't know why it's so popular actually as a myth, because the one thing that it does bug me a little bit is when it's used as a reason the fish might have passed away. People blame there wasn't wood, and in the wild they might not have wood. It's just one of those sort of old myths. So Mr. G has to go. Have a good walk and vibes. Have a good rest of the day and have a good run. So I think I'll go on to a little bit. I think one of the last topics is just carnivory. because some loricariids are carnivores. There is sometimes you'll see the myth that loricariids, plecos, get more carnivorous with age. That's not true. I guess it probably stems from a lot of people thinking that diets do change with age in a lot of animals. But with fishes, it's not entirely, unless they're gape limited, so their mouth can only fit over certain food items. Otherwise, it's just a lot of them just aren't carnivores, but there are quite a few like Pseudocanthicus, Scobian ancistrus, potentially the rest of the Canthicus clade. I don't think people really know about. There isn't actually a clear idea on Canthicus or Megalancistrus. Oh, and also Leprocanthicus is definitely a carnivore. But there's lots of myths about what is and what isn't. Those ones I'm mentioning because they definitely are, and they're the ones you're most likely to see outside of Loricariidae, so like substrate dwelling Loricariids. And the main emphasis here of diet is always to research, and there's so many different sources. I've written, I think I counted about 10 articles just on loricariid diets for my website. So it's one of those things that a lot on carnivores, but also be careful if you're gonna assume they're a carnivore and they're not, they're more prone to bloat, as I mentioned earlier. But anyway, I've got quite a bit to do in a bit, so I might actually head out myself. I'm planning on doing a podcast, maybe slightly live stream with other people. Might not be part of this channel entirely because I've got my website and I actually have a channel associated with the website. It's just got no videos on it. And I kind of wanted maybe this to be more of my, and that to be more connected with the website, which I'm happy for if people want to help contribute to it. So I'll be doing that sort of thing, and it won't be just discussing plecos. It'll be discussing all sorts of different fish things, looking at the scientific point of view. But anyway, I'll probably end that here because I'm quite tired as well. So anyway, have a good day, everyone. Hopefully everyone has a good end of the week, and goodbye.